So have you ever sat down to develop a training program and you're sitting there going, where do I even start? I'm so confused. What the heck goes into developing that full-fledged training program that I can utilize to get my weightlifters to the absolute top, the absolute peak of the sport, to make a senior world team, to make a senior Olympic team, whatever that might be? A lot of coaches struggle to really break down where can they even begin. And this is something that a lot of weightlifting coaches can relate to. There's athlete types that we've got to figure out. There's periodization models that we've got to sift through, read about. There's different aspects of, do we try and push strength a little bit more? What kind of technique do we want to develop? How much nutrition goes into developing these athletes? And all of these different factors come into play when we're trying to decipher how to generate a champion. And that's where we want to start right here, is what is the ultimate goal behind Olympic weightlifting, right? What is that ultimate goal? The goal is that we can have an Olympic weightlifter step onto the platform and execute a snatch as precisely as possible with as much weight as possible. That second key is to develop a weightlifter that can step out onto the platform and clean and jerk as precisely as possible with as much weight as possible. So we've got to take a step back and recognize it's a pretty simple task for us as coaches, that all we've got to do is get athletes to be as repeatable as possible with their technique in the snatch and with their technique in the clean and jerk. If they can repeat these things over and over and over again, well, now we're going to get them stronger, and now we can develop an Olympic weightlifter who's going to be automatic. They're going to hit the attempts that we need them to hit. But coaching is not that easy. We don't exist in this little bubble where it's just pressing buttons and everything is working on command. We've got to take that step back and we've got to think, where does everything actually begin? And it begins with our athletes, okay? So we've got to sit there and say, if someone walks into the door, we've got to break down and say, all right, the first goal is to figure out what athlete type we're dealing with. And there's going to be 3 specific types, okay? So there's going to be type 1, type 2, and type 3. And if we can think about when an athlete walks in the door at your gym, at your Olympic weightlifting club, whatever it might be, at your facility, at your college, whatever it is, we've got to try to figure out, who are we dealing with? What is that type of person? And I like to sit there and say that type 1 athlete is going to be that athlete who's more Zen-like. They're going to be the individual who's always coming in, they're very logical, and they're just going to approach the training session from a logical perspective. They might break down here and there emotionally, but for the most part, they're the ones that are going to come in, they're going to listen to the coach, and they're going to execute as well as they possibly can. That second athlete type is going to be a little bit more fragile. They might be up and down, and we've got to try and recognize that that's a lot of people. That's just a lot of people's personalities, and that's okay. This isn't a negative judgment of that individual, but instead, it's just recognizing that this person, the type 2, might come in and tell you they feel like crap, their life's about to end, they're never going to be able to Olympic weightlift heavy, they're never going to snatch heavy, they're never going to clean and jerk heavy, and then the very next day they might come in and hit these massive PRs. And those are different types of athletes. They're a little bit more challenging because you've got to take the emotion out of it from your side and recognize that they might struggle a little bit to handle stress. And that's okay. And that's where, as coaches, we've got to take that step back and we've got to help them handle stress as much as possible. Now, that third type of athlete is going to be the athletes that are a little bit more of the meathead. They're the ones that are going to come in, they're high energy, they want to get after it. They're hammering bars down to the floor, they're hitting big lifts all the time, and they'll push themselves to the brink of death. They're the ones that will barely pull clean off the floor, and they're diving down to get it no matter what. And the problem is with these athletes is that they are going for broke all the time. So we've got to try and figure out how we can put a governor on them as coaches, and we've got to try and figure out how we can still help them develop a good technical movement while still bringing that aggressiveness to the platform. And we've got to remember, ultimately, what's the goal here? The goal is that when an athlete walks in your door, you've got to start to figure out what are their habits. Are they biting their nails? Are they super nervous? Or are they very precise in that they're laying out their backpack here, and then they put their shoes together very uniformly, and then they put on their socks properly in this specific way, and they have a very specific routine every single day that they go about? Or are they the athletes that come in and tell you all of their life problems and I've had such a rough day? Or are they the athlete that come in and they're blasting heavy metal or hard rock, whatever it might be, and they want to get after it, right? So if we can start to analyze who these athletes are on a regular basis, that's going to help us work towards that ultimate goal of repetitive precision. And what this does is once we start to recognize what type of athletes we're dealing with, now we can sort of take a step back and we can sit there and say, what is that next step that we can take? And that's where we can start to figure out, okay, we know for a fact that to be precise, to have repetitive precision, we have to understand technique. And we have to have a technical model as coaches. We need to know as Olympic weightlifting coaches exactly what positions we want to see from the floor to the knee, from below the knee to above the knee. We call that no man's land. What happens through no man's land? What happens when we get to the reciprocation point? What's the bar doing into the hip? What are the feet doing? What's the upper body doing? And then we need to know exactly what happens from the hip to the catch. And if we're talking about the jerk, we need to know exactly how that dip looks, how that drive should look, how the split position should be. And every time we have an Olympic weightlifter step in the door, type 1, type 2, type 3, we know what kind of technical issues they have, and we need to develop a system that's going to help them learn the technique you want them to lift. Not only from a physical perspective, but we want to engage with them and teach them this so they become students of the game. And that's where it's very, very important in understanding the athlete type you're dealing with. That's what leads to that technical development. And then we can start to factor in, okay, let's develop this technique by enhancing their strength. Okay, so if we can think about strength movements are going to be squats, pulls, right? Then we can start thinking about those strength movements, and that's where we can start to lump things into buckets here. So we've got, all right, squats, pulls. So if we can think about back squats, front squats, box squats, safety bar squats, single leg squats, snatch pulls, clean pulls, pulls to a target, anything along these lines, lift offs. And then when we get back to the technical aspect, we can start to think about the physical movement as snatch, clean and jerk. So these are competitive movements, and then we've got variations, right? So variations might be anything along the lines of a power snatch, a low hang snatch, a power jerk, if they're a split jerker, a power clean, a one box clean, two box cleans, two box snatches, anything along these lines, pauses, all of those different variations are going to help develop technique. And yes, to a point, squats and pulls are going to help us tremendously in developing technique, but ultimately that's going to be what we utilize to develop strength. So then we start to figure out that we've got technique, we've got snatch, clean, jerk, we've got those variations. We've got the strength work, we've got squats, and we've got pulls, right? But then we've got to figure out how can we mold this together from that macro perspective. And that's where periodization comes into play. And that's just horrible handwriting on my part, but that's when we start to think about it from a big picture. We start to think about periodizing how we want to develop our Olympic weightlifters, because our ultimate goal is that repetitive precision. When they step on the platform, they can repeat the same movement as they would if there's 150 kilos on the bar, and it would be the exact same movement as if there was 30 kilos on the bar. So we need to make sure that's the ultimate goal, okay? We need to make sure that the movement is precise. And obviously we want that weight to be heavier when they're competing, but we've got to recognize strength is a big goal, technique is a big goal, understanding what type of athlete we have is a huge goal. And then that brings us to periodization. And so if we can think about periodizing this plan, now we can start to factor in, oh my gosh, now we can start to pull these athletes through this long period of time very effectively. And that's where we get into this. So now we start to figure out, okay, there's different blocks that can focus on different aspects of the sport. So then when we take that big step back and we want to pretend, we're the Muppet Master looking down upon our athletes and what their weaknesses are and what their strengths are and what their technical issues are, now we can start to recognize, okay, so if we've got a type 1 athlete, a Zen athlete, we can work them through this whole storyline, this whole framework here. And that's where periodization comes into play. And what we utilize is parabolic periodization. And so we've created this here at Garage Strength as a model that's slightly undulating, but it's also based around the athlete type. So when we can understand what type of athlete we're working with, we can understand how they respond emotionally, how they respond physically, how they respond technically. Physically being how quickly they adapt to strength gains, technically being how coordinated they are, how rapidly they can pick up aspects of coordination and technique. But the biggest factor here is the emotional aspect behind periodization, and that's where we come into this storyline in parabolic periodization. We can start off with that exposure phase so we can bring them into this storyline. We can start to get them into shape. We can start to stimulate their body to adapt, to work towards that repetitive precision. And we know that based off of the Zen athlete, their numbers of variations are going to be a little bit higher than the fragile athlete. We know that their squats are going to be a little bit more consistent. We know that their pulls are going to transfer over a little bit better in some instances. And then we're going to get into that comprehension phase. So during the comprehension phase, our weightlifters are going to start to understand what's going on. They're going to start to feel a little bit better on the platform. They're going to feel a little bit more consistent with their movement. They're going to start to feel a little bit stronger. And that's going to lead into that ascension phase. So if we can think about, we're climbing a mountain and all of a sudden now we're starting to ascend that mountain. We're starting to get that work in. We're really starting to drive forward. And this is the absolute biggest block that we've got to think about in terms of periodization. The ascension phase is the absolute most important training part, because now's when all that work is going to be put in. Now's when we're going to be hammering forward. We're going to be getting a ton of volume in. We're going to be learning the technique effectively. And if we can think back to that athlete type with the meatheads, we've got to recognize that if you're dealing with type 3, you've got to really control where they're at during the ascension phase, because they might start to feel very, very strong, very, very explosive, but we've got to control them. We can't have early on in the training these monstrous lifts, because we need to make sure that that's happening during the summit phase. And if now we can think about, you're climbing Mount Everest and you're about to summit and you're getting to the summit and you do indeed summit. Now it's all of this work has paid off. You've achieved this great, tremendous feat. You've gotten to the top. You've had this incredible feeling. And then after that summit phase, we're going to lead into about a week to 3 week time frame known as the realization phase. And the realization phase is going to be that aha moment, that moment where athletes just feel complete zen, as I like to refer to it, different from that type 1 athlete, but that just feeling that of euphoria, just complete amazing awesomeness, right? Where you get on the platform, you grab the bar, and the weightlifter knows exactly what's going to happen, and they have a quiet mind because they're in that realization phase. All distractions are outside of their head, and instead their body is doing what you as a coach has trained it to do. You've taught the weightlifter, you've taught the human body that you're dealing with from an emotional perspective, from a strength perspective, from a technical perspective, to execute as well as humanly possible. And that's what we culminate, that's what we create, we cultivate, and it culminates during that summit and during that realization phase. And so what we've got to think about as coaches is that inside the parabolic periodization program, we've got to recognize that a lot of coaching is just based around that physical organism. It's just based around adaptation. That's it, adaptation, adaptation. That's all we're trying to get is adaptation. But if we can even think about great philosophers like Carl Jung and Albert Einstein, these are men that were phenomenal scientists. And both of them referred to teachers that they would work with that were more emotionally invested in them. That's who helped them along their journey the most. And that is what brings us to the parabolic periodization model, is that we need to look at ourselves as the guide. We need to look at ourselves as Obi-Wan Kenobi. We need to look at ourselves in the light as we're trying to help the heroes. The hero is the athlete. The athlete is the hero. They're on a serious journey, and we need to help guide them along. And to do that, to achieve that repetitive precision, we have to engage emotionally, and we have to understand who they are, and then we have to understand how each type responds to strength stimulus, how each type responds to technical stimulus, and then how that all pieces together in this storyline that we refer to as periodization. And if you want more information about this, you can head over to GarageStrength.com. We put a whole course together based around parabolic periodization. It's got the entire breakdown of what each athlete type is, how to diagnose your type, and even from the perspective of technique and strength, we have an entire book that goes as the companion to our course. If you head over to GarageStrength.com, you can click on the link down below and you can pick up your parabolic periodization book and course today. But as we finish out this whole system of the coach's guide to Olympic weightlifting, we've got to recognize, you have to understand this is the goal. Repetitive precision over and over and over again. We've got to understand that. Then we've got to take a step back. What's it about? It's about the athletes. It's about the hero. It's about developing the athletes emotionally, recognizing who they are from an emotional perspective, and then creating your entire system around strength and around technical work and accessory work along those lines to develop all throughout this long journey, this whole storyline that's going to expose them to the troubles that they're going to be facing. It's going to help them comprehend what's coming at them, and they're going to start to develop. They're going to start to ascend during their journey and feel stronger and develop. Ultimately, they're going to summit and feel this euphoric achievement, and then it just gets rinsed, washed, and repeated over and over again, and your understanding of who you're dealing with develops over and over again, and those athletes start to buy into you as coaches. Those athletes buy into who you are. They buy into your training system because they want to compete for you, and you as a coach want to coach for them as well. And it's this great system of reciprocity where we're both looking out for each other because we have the best interests at heart. We aren't just looking at an organism. We are looking at a physical individual who has emotions and who responds differently to technique cues and strength cues. And ultimately, that's how we have to piece together our entire training system in the parabolic periodization model so that we can achieve the absolute best performances possible. If you want more information about coaching and Olympic weightlifting, you can head over to GarageStrength.com and you can pick up a parabolic periodization course and book. If you want more videos, you can click on this card right here about Olympic weightlifting training. Until next time, guys, peace.